mic on here a sec. Okay, so actually it'll probably be just myself presenting. I'll first introduce myself. My name's E.J. Vroon, and I'm a student out at Trinity Western University. And my partners are Leung and Teresa Steinfort, and we're working on our thesis together under the supervision of Dr. Paul Wong, whose work was just spoken about briefly. So the work that we've been doing is based on a new idea of Dr. Wong's, which is largely based on Frankl's work, and the construct is called Tragic Optimism. And we've gotten kind of a funny reception to that, because people think, well, that doesn't sound like very optimistic to me. But Tragic Optimism is basically just the idea that Frankl had, that in any circumstance, a person can choose to have a positive attitude. Now, before I get into this any further, we're just going to go through the outline here. We're going to give you an idea of some of the existing models of optimism, the rationale for tragic optimism. I'll get a little more into the details of the definition as well. Then we'll define the 5 elements of tragic optimism as Dr. Wong has developed them. We'll go through our development of the life attitude scale, which is our scale measuring tragic optimism, and then we'll give you an idea of some clinical applications that we thought it might have. Okay, so to begin with, and some of these might be quite familiar to some of you, existing models of optimism tend to be either competency-based, so you have Snyder's hope scale, and basically that's broken up into agency and pathways. So a person is optimistic based on whether they have a feeling that they can accomplish things and that they have a number of options or pathways available to them that they can accomplish. There's dispositional-based optimism, the work of Shire and Carver. They did a life orientation test, and basically it's based on the idea that some people are born a little more optimistic or pessimistic than other people, or some people tend to be a lot more optimistic. And you get the sense from Shire and Carver that these folks are much more likely to feel a sense of competency. And they've done a lot of work with, trying to gain some support that optimism has a lot to do with health. And so they're actually very prominent in the field. Then there's also Dr. Seligman's attribution theory. And attribution is basically if a person is optimistic, they tend to attribute positive things to, say, more internal, global, stable type factors. Whereas a pessimist might say, well, if I accomplished something, I was quite lucky, and if something bad happened to me, it's because, well, I deserved it or something like that. So that's attribution theory. And then you get into a meaning-based. There's Dr. Wong's existential model of tragic optimism, which actually comes out of Frankl, again, Frankl's idea of tragic optimism. And basically, our goal, Dr. Wong has already developed this idea, but our goal was to develop a scale to measure tragic optimism and to validate it as a measurable construct. So we felt that the scale itself would be multi-dimensional, meaning there's 5 elements to it. It encompasses both optimism and pessimism. And on the overhead there you can see we theorized that there would be five essential elements to it. And actually these might be quite familiar to you as well, because we spoke, Dr. Taylor spoke about courage, but there's also the idea of acceptance, affirmation of meaning, faith, and self-transcendence. And some of these are also familiar from Dr. Wong's personal meaning profile. So we'll just get into the 5 elements of tragic optimism. Actually, what I'll do before that is kind of give you an idea of why we thought tragic optimism might be necessary. Now, essentially, a lot of the current or existing models of optimism are based, out of the Western world. So you've got North American or European researchers doing work on European and North American people. And one thing that's fairly common in North America is the idea that, if you dream it, you can achieve it, or that life tends to be more good than bad. So if you just endure something for a while, things are bound to, look up. And one example of that is the stock market. It crashes all the time, but, you can assume that eventually it's going to go up above that 10,000 barrier again, and everything will be fine. And what we were really thinking of was that idea is not common to all cultures. Not all people live in cultures where things are better or are generally more positive than they are negative. If you think of, say, Afghanistan or places in Africa, where there's generally, people don't get enough food to eat. They try and don't accomplish things. We just thought that a competency-based or a dispositional-based optimism, while they are certainly excellent models to apply to North Americans and Western Europeans, they may not fully apply to people who have either experienced trauma. When you have a trauma, you don't see the world the same way, or people who are generally disadvantaged and haven't experienced success with minimal effort. So I'll go into the 5 elements now. The first element is affirmation of meaning. So it's the inherent meaning, or it's an affirmation, of the inherent meaning, purpose, and value in life, regardless of your circumstances. Okay? It's also an affirmation of the positive values of life, such as freedom to pursue visions, dreams, or happiness. The second element, and this is where I'd mentioned earlier that this construct encompasses both optimism and pessimism. This is where we encounter what we would call sort of a realistic pessimism, and it's the idea of acceptance. And acceptance is the recognition that suffering and evil are an inevitable part of this life. It's a willingness to face the present reality, and acceptance of my own limitations, weaknesses, and all the misfortunes that have come my way. So generally, this may not fit too well with, positive illusions, things like that. This is basically a real assessment of the situation and saying, this is pretty terrible, and you end up with a sense of what we would call realistic pessimism. And out of that can come what we feel is a more mature type of optimism. The third element is courage, and courage is the willingness to face obstacles and danger in order to be true to one's own convictions, pursue goals, and to stay alive. And as Dr. Taylor was saying, it sometimes takes a lot of courage to stay alive or to wake up in the morning. So we feel that's a very much a part of tragic optimism. We'll try to be quick, but not too quick. The fourth element is faith. And faith is the willingness to have trust in God. Now, you could read that providence or a higher power, even to some degree other people, in spite of doubts and seemingly hopeless situations. And the fifth element is self-transcendence. And that's the capacity to rise above situational constraints, self-interest, and other limiting factors in order to contribute to humanity and make a difference in the world. And in a sense, it's like Adler's idea of living as if, right? You live as if you weren't suffering, as if you didn't have all these limiting factors in order to, say, be an example to other people and provide the world with meaning. So it doesn't negate the idea of suffering, but it allows a person to rise above it. So the actual development of our scale, we've got it broken down into a few different studies here. Because we're working as a team, we're doing 3 different studies. It's just kind of part of the deal. So item analysis, we generated 42 items. And initially, we did some, because it is a theoretical scale, we wanted to make sure all our questions actually made sense on a purely intuitive level. So we distributed these 42 items to 8 judges for what's called face validity. And that's basically, where do you think these fit? Does it make sense over there? And so once that was finished, we actually found quite a bit of agreement among people. If more than 2 people disagreed on something, we just eliminated the item altogether. 417 participants responded to the items by an internet survey. And we did factor analysis on that to determine whether we had a decent factor structure. And 32 items remained after factor analysis. And basically, it doesn't come down to these 5 factors perfectly. It came down to, I think it was 7, which made sense conceptually given some of the definitions that we have. And so we felt that if it consistently comes out with these factors, there's 2 factors that have 2 parts each. I won't bore you with the details there, but in any case, the factorial validity looked pretty good. And those are our items there. I don't know if you can even read them in the back. But essentially our finished, our finalized scale has 32 items. And these are actually currently posted on the internet, and we'll give you the address later so you can help us graduate. So for study 2, after we actually developed the scale, we wanted to make sure, well, is this scale any good? Is it valid? So we compared the life attitude scale with Shire and Carver's life orientation test. Now I believe that is 6 questions or 8 questions. Yeah, it's a very short test. And then Snyder's hope scale, which he calls goal scale for the present when he's testing it on people. And then we also correlated it with Wong's personal meaning profile. And we had a few different hypotheses there. Now, we figured that our life attitude scale would score positively with other scores of, or with other scales of optimism. Probably not not very high, because we have the idea of acceptance, which incorporates an element of pessimism. But we thought overall we would get a positive correlation, and also a high positive correlation with a personal meaning profile, because it is quite similar in some respects to our scale, but also because it deals with personal meaning. Now the kicker here is that we wanted to make sure that acceptance had a negative correlation. So generally, people who are tragically optimistic are people who are not only optimistic, but score high on acceptance as well. So we thought, well, if that's the case, acceptance has to negatively correlate with these other profiles. And so here's just some data that we got. If you compare the life attitude scale to the life orientation test, overall the correlation is significant. Actually, all three of those are significant at the 0.01 level. And that's your overall score. And what was interesting too is that, okay, if you take acceptance, we wanted a negative correlation, and we did in fact find that people who scored high on acceptance tended to score lower, say on the life orientation test, also on the hope scale, and on the PMP. You notice the PMP it's not a significant correlation. We felt that's probably because we didn't have all that many subjects. The statistical power just wasn't really that high. So we were not sure if we would get a significant result there or not. And there you see that, again, the life attitude scale does correlate with other measures. And you'll notice that it correlates a lot higher with the PMP than it does with the other two. So we were actually quite, I guess, surprised and pleased with those results. And another interesting thing that I just wanted to point out on there is usually, just kind of anecdotally, faith and hope are sort of, put together as things that are quite related. And actually, if you look at faith and the goal scale for the present, there's no real correlation there. And what that really showed us was that faith, or probably anyway, that faith has more to do with a sense of surrender or giving over your life, whereas hope, as defined by the goal scale for the present, has a lot more to do with agency, right? So there's some very interesting things at work there. I'll just move along. We also did another sort of an interesting hypothesis, and that was that people who are high in tragic optimism would not believe in euthanasia. So we asked a question, are you in favor of euthanasia? And we felt that people who were high in affirmation, overall high in tragic optimism, would have to say that, if life is meaningful no matter what, it's kind of hard to reconcile that with doctor-assisted suicide. And what we found was that, on the whole, we were right on that in fact there's a very significant correlation there. Basically, that if a person believes in doctor-assisted suicide, they're not going to be high in tragic optimism, and the other way around as well. We noticed a couple of interesting things, and that was people high in courage didn't necessarily believe or not believe in euthanasia. And we had some ideas about that, but I thought I might even open it up to the audience to kind of maybe postulate as to why that might be. Does anybody want to take a stab at it?
Well, they might consider it courageous to decide to end your life.
Yeah.
Taking a stand, no matter whether it's positive or negative.
Sure.
More active.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly right. And we figure, too, that in our society generally, it's it's still kind of taboo, the whole subject of doctor-assisted suicide. It's maybe becoming a little less so. But someone, according to our definition of courage anyway, it's somebody's willingness to stick up to their convictions no matter what society says. So by that definition, somebody could decide to end their life, and that would be a courageous act. And another interesting one was that self-transcendence. There was no significant difference between those groups in terms of whether or not they believed in euthanasia. And that one's a little tougher. But I see Diane maybe wants to take a stab at it.
Oh, go ahead, it's yours.
I'll open that one up for guesses too, if anyone wants to.
Well, I was just thinking that maybe you're beyond that, like, you know, you sort of have such a faith that there's a future that
Yeah.
the little kind of day-to-day decisions that you make, you kind of transcend that and realize that that's not so important.
Yeah. You know, that actually could well be. And self-transcendence is basically we sort of guess that maybe it's because people who have made up their mind to die tend to be pretty generous and tend to, sort of not even think about their own life, but start to, focus on other people. But we're by no means sure of that one. Yep. Well, that's an interesting question. We started out with mainly a Christian population, I would say, but then it started to spread, and we ended up with people of various religious backgrounds, a fairly heterogeneous sample. But again, it's all internet respondents, so people without internet. Age-wise, we do have that information, but not in front of me. Yeah. Did we do that one? Age and no. See, we didn't. We did a few sort of just to see if any of these things sort of interacted, and okay, I'm just going to have to go back there. Oh, thanks. Yeah. So.
It seems like it's a denial of self. So in that sense, one might.
Yeah.
There might not be a correlation between keeping myself alive
Yeah.
and my being alive would burden others, and I might prefer to be dead.
Sure, you could sure see it that way.
In that sense, it would be kind of self-transcendent.
Yeah.
If that's the way the respondents saw it.
Sure.
They may have seen it that way, but I wasn't the person who was doing that. It seemed.
Yeah. It's entirely possible that, there has been some talk about, people who are chronically ill and who decide to take their lives, that a lot of them are depressed. And so they may well see life that way. Yeah.
If it's defined as not, self-transcendence is defined as not really personal self-reliance.
Right.
You have an awful job.
You got to give me 5 minutes? Okay. So study 3 is one that is currently ongoing. And my partner here has some business cards that she's going to hand out, and that sort of gives you an idea of where you can find the survey. I have a good buddy who's a webmaster, and he's developed quite an interesting website. So you can actually fill out the scales and get your results immediately, and that's provided quite a draw. We were actually very surprised, getting say 400 subjects emailing in within a couple of weeks, or not emailing in, but just filling them out, and we get the data right away. And there's some obvious limitations to doing internet research, but there's a lot of promise to it as well. So anyway, study 3, construct validity. We're basically seeking to differentiate trauma versus non-trauma groups by their scores on what's called the Stressful Life Experiences Screen and the Life Attitudes Scale. So the problem with measuring trauma is that a person generally has to have experienced a negative event of some kind of severity, and they have to have some kind of a reaction to that event. So we want to figure out, okay, who are the people who have experienced trauma in terms of actual symptomology and that sort of thing from those who have not. And the other thing we want to do is correlate scores on the Life Attitude Scale with the scores on the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory. And we want to see if our scale will actually predict scales on post-traumatic growth. So we've got a few hypotheses there as well, or I should say a couple. People high who score high overall in the Life Attitude Scale, we would predict would be high in post-traumatic growth as well. These are people who have accepted the trauma that they've gone through, and in spite of that have been able to grow in affirmation, right, in self-transcendence in these other areas. Hypothesis two is that people who have experienced trauma are generally going to score high on acceptance, whereas people who haven't experienced trauma probably would be less likely to do that. There's some question as to whether vicarious traumatization might count. It's by no means clean cut at this point, but we would expect that a person who's high in acceptance and low in the other four would basically be pessimistic. So they would accept things, but acceptance without being spurred on basically doesn't get you too far. It's like, you're just really pessimistic. Now, a person high in acceptance and high in the other four, as I said, would probably be high on the post-traumatic growth inventory as well. So in terms of clinical implications, we're hoping that this could be used as an assessment tool. And basically, we want to test people how high they are on the different scales. And I should mention here that overall score on this instrument is much less important than scores on the various subscales, just because you're measuring two different things. You're measuring the acceptance, and you're measuring the more optimistic side of things. So you want to measure the person's acceptance, and you want to measure how well they've adjusted in terms of the other four. So that would allow you to specify areas in therapy that this person might need to grow in. For instance, if the person needs to grow in self-transcendence, you could do what Adler did and just prescribe them to go out and help people with things. If they need help with their faith, there are ways to help people with that, to develop that, and to search for that. So we're quite aware of some of the limitations, but we're also quite hopeful at this point that we might actually contribute something.